But they don't understand. The dark isn't the enemy. It never was. The dark is honest. It doesn't pretend. It doesn't lie to you with fake smiles and empty promises. People do. They build their fragile little worlds in the light, convincing themselves they're safe, that everything is under control. But the moment the lights flicker, the moment life stops playing nice, they panic, they break, they run. Because they were never built for reality. But monsters are different. We don't run from the dark. We were shaped by it. Every betrayal, every failure, every sleepless night, it didn't weaken us. It carved us into something colder, something sharper. While they were chasing comfort, we were learning how to survive without it. You see, fear only controls those who still have something to lose, something to protect, something to hide. But when you've already lost everything, when the world has already shown you its worst, they tell you the dark is where fear lies, that it's something to avoid, something to escape from as fast as you can. Since childhood, you're trained to believe that light means safety and darkness means danger. But that's the first lie they feed you, the most comfortable one. Because if you stay afraid of the dark, you'll never look closely enough to see what's really there. The dark doesn't create fear. It reveals it. In the light, everything is dressed up. People wear their masks better when they're seen. Smiles are easier under bright lights. Promises sound more believable. You don't question things when everything looks clean and clear. The light gives people a stage, and on that stage, everyone becomes an actor. They play roles: friend, leader, hero, whatever keeps the illusion alive. But the moment the lights go out, the performance ends. In the dark, there's no audience to impress, no image to protect, no distractions to hide behind. It strips everything down to what it really is. And that's what terrifies people, not the darkness itself, but the truth it exposes. The same person who looked confident in the light starts to hesitate. The same voice that sounded powerful begins to shake. Because without the spotlight, there's nothing left to hold the act together. The dark is quiet, and in that silence, you hear things you've been avoiding, doubts, regrets. The things people bury under noise and routine suddenly crawl to the surface. That's why most people can't sit with it for long. They rush back to the light, back to the noise, back to the comfort of pretending. But if you stay there, if you stop running, something changes. Your eyes adjust. What once looked empty starts to take shape. You begin to notice details you were blind to before. The truth isn't loud or dramatic. It's subtle, patient, waiting for you to stop distracting yourself long enough to see it. And once you do, it's impossible to unsee. You realize how fragile the light really is, how easily it flickers, how dependent it is on everything going exactly right. But the dark doesn't depend on anything. It doesn't break. It doesn't collapse. It just exists, steady and unforgiving. And that's where clarity comes from, not from comfort, not from constant reassurance, but from facing what's real without filters. In the dark, you see people for who they are, not who they pretend to be. You see the cracks in everything they built, the weaknesses they tried to hide. And more importantly, you see yourself the same way. They tell you society is built on order, on rules, on some invisible structure that keeps everything from collapsing. They make it sound strong, unshakable, like it's designed to protect you. But look closer, and you start to notice something unsettling. It's not strength holding it together. It's illusion. Everything around you is carefully arranged to feel stable, not to be stable. People wake up every day and follow routines they never question. They chase goals they didn't choose. They repeat beliefs they never tested. And as long as everyone keeps playing along, the system looks solid. It feels real. But that's the trick. Something doesn't have to be true to feel convincing. It just has to be repeated enough times. Confidence is manufactured. Authority is performed. Even morality is often just a script handed down and accepted without resistance. The moment you stop and ask why, the cracks begin to show. And most people don't like that. They'd rather protect the illusion than face what's underneath it. Because truth is uncomfortable. Truth doesn't guarantee safety. It doesn't promise fairness. It doesn't wrap itself in comforting explanations. It exposes how fragile everything really is. So instead, society builds layers, stories, expectations, labels to make chaos look like order, to make weakness look like control. They tell you to stay positive, to trust the process, to believe that everything happens for a reason. Not because it's always true, but because it keeps you calm. A calm person doesn't question. A calm person doesn't disrupt the pattern. And that's where the real weakness hides. A system that depends on people not thinking too deeply is not strong. It's delicate. It survives only as long as no one pushes too hard. No one looks too closely. No one steps out of line. The moment pressure is applied, the moment reality stops cooperating, the illusion starts to crack. You see it when things go wrong, when plans fail, when comfort disappears. The same people who seemed so certain, so in control, begin to panic. Their confidence fades because it was never built on anything solid. It was borrowed from the system, from the collective agreement to pretend everything made sense. But when that agreement breaks, so do they. Strength doesn't come from pretending things are stable. It comes from knowing they're not and moving forward anyway. It comes from understanding that the world isn't fair, that outcomes aren't guaranteed, that control is often an illusion. Most people avoid that realization because it strips away their sense of security. But without that realization, they remain dependent. Dependent on structure, dependent on approval, dependent on the idea that someone somewhere has everything under control. And that belief keeps them comfortable, but it also keeps them weak, because the moment that structure fails, and it always does, they have nothing left to stand on. They tell you pain is something to avoid, something unfortunate, something unfair, something that shouldn't happen if life is going the way it's supposed to. They teach you to run from it, to numb it, to hide it behind distractions and fake smiles. Because pain makes people uncomfortable. Not just your pain, theirs too. But pain doesn't weaken you. It exposes you. In comfort, you don't really know who you are. When everything is easy, when things go your way, you're just reacting to convenience. You don't have to think deeply. You don't have to push yourself. You don't have to face anything real. You exist in a version of life where nothing challenges you enough to change you. But pain interrupts that illusion. It forces you to confront what you've been avoiding. It strips away the layers you built to protect your ego. Suddenly, you're not who you thought you were. You're not as strong, not as certain, not as in control. And that realization hurts more than anything else. Not the situation itself, but what it reveals about you. That's where most people break. They don't break because of the pain. They break because they refuse to face it. They resist it, deny it, try to escape it as quickly as possible. And in doing that, they lose the one thing pain was trying to give them: clarity. Because pain is precise. It shows you exactly where you're vulnerable. Exactly where you've been careless. Exactly where you've been lying to yourself. It doesn't guess. It doesn't assume. It cuts straight to the truth, whether you're ready for it or not. And that truth has the potential to reshape you into something stronger, something more aware, but only if you let it. Most people don't. They choose comfort over growth. They choose temporary relief over lasting change. They patch the wound instead of understanding why it happened. And so they repeat the same patterns over and over, wondering why nothing ever really improves. But if you stay with the pain, if you stop trying to silence it, it starts to teach you. It sharpens your awareness. It forces you to adapt. It makes you question your decisions, your habits, your assumptions. You start to see patterns you ignored before. You start to recognize the things that actually matter and the things that never did. Pain demands evolution. It doesn't care about your excuses. It doesn't respond to denial. It stays there until you either change or collapse under it. And that pressure, that constant weight, is what forges something different inside you. Not something softer, not something more comfortable, something harder, something more focused. You begin to rely less on others, less on circumstances, less on the illusion that things will always work out. You stop expecting life to be easy. You stop expecting fairness. And in that shift, you gain something most people never do: control over yourself. They tell you fear is natural, that it's a signal, a warning, something that keeps you safe. And for most people, that's exactly what it is: a leash. Invisible, but tight enough to control every decision they make. They build their lives around avoiding it. Avoiding risk. Avoiding loss. Avoiding anything that might shake the fragile sense of security they've created. Because they have something to protect. Comfort. Status. Approval. The image they've spent years building. Fear feeds on those things. The more you have, the more you're afraid to lose. And that fear doesn't just sit quietly. It shapes you. It makes you hesitate. It makes you second guess. It keeps you small while convincing you that you're being careful. But careful isn't strong. Careful is controlled. You start to see it in the way people move, the way they speak. Always measuring, always calculating, always holding something back, not because they lack ability, but because they're afraid of what might happen if things go wrong. They don't take risks unless they're sure of the outcome. They don't speak unless they know they'll be accepted. They don't act unless it's safe. And that's how fear wins. Not by stopping them completely, but by limiting them just enough to keep them predictable, manageable, easy to understand, easy to control. They stay within boundaries they never question, convinced that it's their choice, when in reality, it's their fear making the decision for them. But the broken, They don't operate the same way. When you've already lost what others are trying to protect, fear loses its leverage. It has nothing left to threaten you with, no comfort to take away, no image to destroy, no safety to strip from you. And without that leverage, fear becomes something else. Just a feeling, not a command. That's the difference. Most people feel fear and obey it. The broken feel it and keep moving, not because they're fearless, but because fear no longer defines their limits. It doesn't dictate their actions. It doesn't decide how far they're willing to go. They've already faced the worst in some form: loss, rejection, failure, and they didn't disappear. They didn't stop existing. So the illusion of fear's power begins to fade. And once that illusion cracks, something shifts. You stop waiting for the right moment. You stop needing guarantees. You stop asking for permission, because you understand something most people don't. There is no safe path. There never was. The idea of safety is just another story people tell themselves to feel in control. But control doesn't come from avoiding fear. It comes from moving through it. The broken don't hesitate the same way. They don't calculate every possible outcome. They act, not because they're certain, but because they're no longer paralyzed by uncertainty. And that makes them unpredictable. Hard to contain, hard to manipulate. They tell you losing everything is the worst thing that can happen to a person. That it's the end. The point where there's nothing left to hold on to, nothing left to fight for. And they're right about one thing. It is an end. Just not the kind they think, because what they call loss is actually exposure. People build their lives around attachments. Not just things, people, titles, routines, identities. They wrap themselves in these layers and call it stability. They believe as long as those layers stay intact, they're in control. But control based on possession is fragile. The more you have, the more you depend on it. And dependence is where fear begins to grow. You start guarding everything: your reputation, your relationships, your comfort. You become careful, not because you want to be, but because you have to be. Because one wrong move, one unexpected shift, and everything you've built could disappear. That pressure sits quietly in the background, shaping every decision, every hesitation. That's how fear tightens its grip. It doesn't need to threaten you directly. It just needs to remind you what you might lose. And suddenly, you're no longer acting freely. You're acting defensively. Protecting instead of evolving. Holding on instead of moving forward. But then loss happens. Not gradually. Not gently. It takes everything at once or piece by piece until there's nothing left to protect. And in that moment, something strange happens. The fear that once controlled you starts to fade, because there's nothing left for it to take. The worst case scenario has already played out. The thing you were trying so hard to avoid has already happened. And you're still here, still breathing, still aware. The world didn't end. It just changed. And that realization breaks something inside you. Not your strength, but your illusion of what you needed to survive. You begin to see how much of your fear was tied to things that were never permanent. The job you thought defined you. The people you thought you couldn't live without. The image you spent years maintaining. All of it gone or shaken, and yet you remain. Different, yes. Stripped down, definitely, but not erased. And that's where freedom begins. Not the kind people dream about, the comfortable kind with safety and ease. A harsher kind, a quieter kind. The kind that comes from having nothing left to lose. Because when there's nothing left to protect, there's nothing left to fear losing. Decisions become simpler. You don't hesitate the same way. You don't overthink every step. You don't weigh every outcome against what it might cost you, because the cost has already been paid. The pressure disappears, and in its place, something sharper takes over. Clarity. You start to act without the constant need for approval or security. You stop clinging to things that were never guaranteed. You move differently, not because you're reckless, but because you're no longer bound by the same chains. They like to believe monsters are born different, that there's something wrong from the beginning, something twisted, something unnatural. It helps them sleep at night, thinking there's a clear line between them and what they fear, a line that can't be crossed. But that line doesn't exist. No one starts out as a monster. No one wakes up one day already broken beyond repair. It's a process, slow, subtle, almost invisible at first. A series of moments, each one small enough to ignore on its own, but together they start to change something deeper. It begins with disappointment. Not the kind you brush off and forget, but the kind that lingers. The kind that makes you question what you believed about people, about fairness, about how things are supposed to work. You adjust. You tell yourself it's just part of life. You move on, then it happens again and again. Each time, a little piece of trust wears away. Not all at once. Just enough to notice if you're paying attention. But most people aren't. They keep going, pretending nothing's changed, even as something inside them starts to shift. Then comes betrayal, the kind that doesn't just hurt. It rewrites your understanding of everything. Someone you relied on, someone you believed in, shows you a side you never expected. And suddenly, the rules you thought were real don't apply anymore. Loyalty feels like a weakness. Trust feels like a mistake. You adapt again. You become more guarded, more aware, less willing to believe without proof. And from the outside, it still looks normal. Responsible even. Like you're learning, growing, becoming stronger. But the change doesn't stop there. Pressure builds. Failures stack up. Effort doesn't always lead to reward. Doing the right thing doesn't guarantee the right outcome. And slowly, the connection between action and result starts to blur. You begin to realize that the system you trusted isn't as fair as you were told. That realization hardens you. You stop expecting things to work out. You stop assuming people will do what's right. You start preparing for the worst, not because you want to, but because experience has taught you that it's more reliable than hope. And then comes the moment, the one where you have a choice, not a dramatic one, not something obvious, just a quiet decision where you can either hold on to what you used to believe, or let it go completely. Let go of the idea that things should be fair. Let go of the need to play by rules that were never consistent. And when you let go, something changes permanently. You stop reacting the way you used to. You stop feeling the same hesitation, the same guilt, the same need to justify yourself, because the framework that created those feelings is gone, replaced by something colder, more direct. It's not chaos. It's clarity without illusion. You see the world as it is, not as it pretends to be. You understand people without the filters you once relied on. And that understanding changes how you move, how you think, how you respond. From the outside, they call it becoming a monster. But from the inside, it feels like finally seeing everything clearly.